Hey everyone, I'm Amethescent, and I made a Halloween-inspired game in 10 days for a local game jam. I've been looking forward to this ever since my last game jam, where I made a turn-based combat game. That game was a great step up from previous projects, and I was proud of it, but I wasn't happy with it. Storytelling has always been my original passion, and I felt like my combat game was lacking in that department. So after that jam, I resolved to make a game that aligned more with the things I love in the next one. This would allow me to polish it to a point where I can be happy with it, while also not feeling rushed and exhausted. And I think I succeeded. So without further ado, here's how I made my story-rich, Halloween-themed game. Day 1. At 9 a.m. sharp, I received the theme, Uh-oh, Retro. This was interesting to me. I didn't really want to make a copy of an older game. I wanted to make something unique, and more importantly, I wanted to make something that was either a horror game or a Halloween-themed game. That has been my goal ever since I participated in this game jam last year, where I failed to make it as Halloween-y as I would have liked due to the constraints of the theme. Nevertheless, it wasn't long before I came up with the idea of making a horror game in a similar style as analog horror videos. You know, like Vidas Carnis, or more famously, The Backrooms. I love watching horror games, to the point where I've kind of become desensitized to it. However, analog horror videos somehow still managed to chill me to the bone, and I thought it would be perfect as a retro horror game. If you watched any analog horror, you'll notice that the quality is on the lower side on purpose. The quote-unquote low-quality camera and microphone only adds to the horror. I was pretty excited about this idea and began designing my analog horror monster. I started formulating ideas for the events of the game, as is usually the first step in my game development process. However, this is where things got rocky, as this was my first jam experience where I just kept ping-ponging between ideas. Although I felt this idea was pretty good, I just couldn't get my brain to work with it. My horror monster design was okay, I guess, but it just didn't feel analog enough. My motivation quickly drained as I kept trying to force the idea, and I decided to take a break. I was not in a good mood. This stage of development usually has this result on me. It's my least favorite part, but this time was different. I wanted this jam experience to be fun and the game to be story-rich, and this concept didn't feel like it would help me achieve that. I've always felt that excessive story within a horror game takes away from the horror. It's hard to recreate a style of horror that's meant for video format in a game. During my break, I began sketching some characters that were just in my head. It was mostly an exercise in releasing my tension and stress from making the game, but I actually really liked the designs. If only I could put them in the game, but they wouldn't fit. So I went back to the analog horror idea, but continued to struggle with it for the rest of the day. Day 2. So, I actually scrapped that analog horror idea. Yeah, it just wasn't working. I wanted to have fun with this game jam, and I didn't think I would have fun with that idea. So I went back to my characters and leaned fully into the idea of a Halloween-themed game. And I'm very glad I did. Even though I don't think it fits the theme as much as my previous idea. I finished designing the characters, which mostly included just redrawing these two, and gave them all names, personalities, and backstories. Their names are Luma, Silas, Theron, and Mireia. Each one is inspired by classic Halloween-y things. Luma is inspired by pumpkins and scarecrows, Silas by ghosts, Theron by bats and vampires, and Mireia by spiders. I was pretty proud of these designs. But then, my brother pointed out that two of my characters reminded him of other existing characters. There's Mireia, who he said reminded him of Muffet from Undertale. I mean, I can definitely see why that would be the case, as they're both humanoid spider people with pigtails and multiple limbs, but I don't think they look too similar. He also said that Silas reminded him of Fi from The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword. And yeah, I can't unsee it now. Oops. Anyway, from what I designed, I was able to come up with a plot that's more character-centered. It turns out that designing a story around the characters is much easier for me than any other story planning strategy. I won't go into great detail about the story as that would spoil the game for those interested in playing. Once I was done with that, I created this sprite sheet for Luma's walk cycle, who I decided would be the main character of the story. I just thought a story about her would be the most interesting based on the backstory I designed for her. Day 3. I began with making idle sprites for all the other characters so I could at least put them in my game. From there, I started a new project in Godot and put in all the assets I had so far. Then I spent some time just making some basics I would need for the game, including the player script and a script for interacting with things. I mostly just copied these from previous games, although I did try to alter the player script to have less if statements. I think I succeeded. Somewhat. As much as I would love to say that my programming skills have improved since the last game jam, I can't. I've had almost no time to spend on developing these skills these past few months, which I am very disappointed about. I feel like there are some strategies I used for this that could have been much easier and simpler if I just had the practice I lacked. I just haven't had the time. I also had some issues with this interactable script. Just some issues with this @tool line, which basically makes it so I can run this code in the editor instead of just in-game. It was an issue with this block of code, which I seem to have with every game I make, where it would just rapid-fire give me these errors about not being able to update it or something. I wish I had a record of it so I could show it, but I completely forgot to do that. I did manage to fix it, however, though I don't remember how. Day 4. I began working on the map for the first section on day 3, but most of it was done and finished on this day. This includes the entry room, hallways, lounge, kitchen, dining room, and study. Then I added collisions to the tile map. For this first section of the game, I planned to have a game of hide and seek that the player would have to play through. For that, I didn't need anything too complex code-wise. My base interactable script doesn't account for animations though, which I needed for the hiders. The plan was for the player to find the hider and interact with them. Then an animation would play where the hider comes out of hiding, pauses for more dialogue, then walks away. I tried my best to work around the restrictions of my interactable script, and it worked, but it got real messy real quick. I knew this wasn't sustainable or a great coding practice, so I turned to another solution: classes. Now, I do have experience with classes in Python and C++, but my programming courses didn't delve too deeply into them, so I'm not that confident in that area. It's also been a while. I'm not really even sure if classes were necessary for this, and it's definitely not perfect, but I tried my best. I began by duplicating my interactable scene and script and stripping it down to its very base form. That way it can be reused for any kind of interactable that I could need. The scene just consists of an area 2D which deals with testing whether the player is inside of the interaction area or not, and then an indicator sprite that I added on later. This indicator is only visible when the player is within range. I also adjusted the script so that it looks like this. It's mostly the same as what it used to be, just reduced. It doesn't need as much code as its more complicated original version. The most important difference is this line, whose job is to signal branching scripts that the player has interacted with it. And then I also made these functions for enabling and disabling the player. And from that, I branched out from this to make an interactable for basic dialogue. I just added it as a node in a new scene and extended the script from the base class. This basically just allows me to use all the code from the original script. For this version, I added 2 extra nodes, a sprite 2D for adding visuals and a collision shape for adding collisions. Here's the script. It's pretty much the same concept as the previous one. The only real difference is the addition of these lines of code with the super phrase. It took me a while to figure out. I needed to be able to update the properties from the base script with each iteration that I had, but it wasn't updating. It turns out I needed to run the base class functions inside the new script, which is apparently done with this super line. And then, finally, I made a version that includes animation. You know, the sole reason why I was doing this whole class thing in the first place. After all this time, I finally got to the part that I actually needed. The scene is pretty much the exact same as the base class scene, The differences are in the script, where I added functionality for adding animations. The variables that I added to be altered in the editor is a variable to import an animation player, a variable for the name of the dialogue, and a variable for the name of the animation. And that's pretty much all. I got that to mostly work and added in the first hider. I won't show where any of the hiders are in case you want to play it yourself. Day 5. On day 5, I started out by solving an issue I had with the animation dialogue sequence, where the player could still walk around even while the second animation was playing. This was an issue because I have the hiders walk away and then hide them when they go off screen. But if the player can move during that animation, they'll be able to see the hider just disappear into thin air, which is not good. I figured out that the issue was that multiple scripts in the scene tested for when any dialogue event finished, and allowed the player to move. I fixed this by giving each kind of interaction state a modifier that changes a variable in the global script. This way, enabling the player only initiates when that specific script tells it to. After fixing that issue, I added in the other two hiders and made it so that once you found them, they would appear at the front of the building and you could interact with them. Taking a break from that, I designed the tile set for the outdoor area and for the inside of a cottage that would be the player's house. I also added UI and functionality for a rudimentary quest system. Nothing too complicated, as the game doesn't have complicated quests, just something to remind the player what they're supposed to be doing. The scene for it is pretty simple. It's just some labels, one that's always visible and one that starts out invisible. This one in the top right is always on screen and shows your current quest. The one in the middle is bigger and only appears when there's a new quest. And then I have this animation player that just fades the middle text in and out. The code is pretty simple too, just some functions to change the quests and show the big text. Back to the hide and seek section of the game, there were quite a few problems I had to fix. I won't go in detail with all of them, but here's a list. It would just take too long to explain. After that, I made the end of section cutscene and wrote its dialogue. And then I spent the rest of the day making the map for the outdoor area. Day 6. On day 6, I finished designing the map for the outdoor area and the indoors of the cottage. The second part of the game was just about going to the other house, so the code wasn't too complicated. I just needed to add in a door that the player could go into. Afterward, I was able to plow through the inside the cottage segment, as the gameplay just required the player to go to bed, go through a cutscene, and leave the cottage. The next part of the game was a bit more complicated. In fact, I'd say that this section of the game was the hardest and most complicated part of making this game. The first part of it was easy as it was just a cutscene between the 4 characters. The second part was not so easy. There are 2 quests in this part of the game that includes collecting items for different characters. For each quest, I added in the characters, dialogue, new sprites I had to make for the collectible items, a way to check how many the player collected, and I had to make sure the dialogue changed based on what stage the player was at. I also had to make sure the player couldn't do this quest before the cutscene played. Because of the nature of this section, I had to make another extension of the interactable base class for objects that can be picked up, which was complicated. I definitely didn't do it right, as I made 3 separate scripts for the different pickups in the game. Not the most efficient or best way of doing it, but I was all out of brain juice at that point, so that's just what I did. Hopefully I can refactor it in future games. I do not like this multiple pickup script business. At first, I wanted the player to be able to choose which quests they wanted to do first, but I knew that would be too complicated as the quests are in separate scenes. Not that I haven't dealt with this issue in past games, but like I said, I was all out of brain juice. In the past, the solution has been complicated anyway. It usually included me having to use a whole lot of if statements and global variables to make sure things stay consistent between scenes and don't reset. I know there's a better way to do it. I just need to find the time to actually learn it. Time is just a rarity for me right now. So instead, I required a specific order to complete the quests and only allowed the player to do the second quest after doing the first. Then after they finish the second quest, it moves on to the next scene, which is a cutscene. On the art side of things, I made and implemented the rest of the walking sprites and drew the expressions for all the characters. Day 7. On day 7, I actually finished the game, which I was very happy about, but it took a lot of work. I began with implementing all the expressions that I drew into the game, which took quite a while. I had to go through all the dialogue I had made so far and make sure the expressions matched with what the characters were saying. After the cutscene I had made the day before, I added in another section where the player goes home with Silas following them. This wasn't that hard, as I had already done all the coding for an NPC that follows the player in a previous game, so I just copied the scene from that game and adjusted it for my needs. Then, when the player goes into the cottage, the process is pretty much the same as what I've said before, adding cutscenes, dialogue, functionality for leaving, etc., etc. You probably get it at this point. And the same for the next section as well, just with an extra part where the player has to pick up some items and place them in another area. And from that, the game goes to the final cutscene, which is just, you guessed it, animations and dialogue. And finally, I created a "The End" screen that shows up when it needs to, then quits the game. And from a general perspective, the game was practically done. As in, you could easily play from start to finish and get the general picture I was going for. Anything else would just be bells and whistles. On the art side of things, I drew a bunch of sprites for the last gameplay section and created this CG for one of the earlier dialogue sections. I also pixelated it to make it look more retro. I just used the square pixelate filter on Ibis Paint. Days 8, 9, and 10. Now, I combined these 3 days because it's mostly just bells and whistles I added on to make the game as polished as I wanted it to be, so it can fit my vision, if you will. When it comes to art, I drew and implemented 4 large artworks. 3 were CGs. 1 was the title screen. I'll only show the non-spoiler images. I also made a shader, except it's not really a shader. Since the beginning, I wanted these lights to actually look like they were emitting light. I thought I needed a shader to do that, but I learned I could just use a canvas item material on a texture and set the blend mode to add. So that's what I did, and I think it looks great. Regarding my game page, I drew the cover art, banner art, and background art. This is actually the first time in a game jam where I actually had the time to decorate the page, so that's good. I also attempted to convert all the character expression artworks to pixel art, but it didn't work out. Pixelating them got rid of the subtle details in their faces that were necessary to convey the emotions that I wanted to convey. And drawing in the expressions in a pixelated style didn't really work out either. On the sound and music side of things, I added in voices for the characters. They just sound like this. I also inserted music, which took a while, as it always does. When it comes to my game, I am very picky about what music I put in, and the sites I usually use for music were severely lacking in the 8-bit music department. I had the most trouble with finding a sad song that would fit my sad scenes. I even tried making my own music, but it didn't work out. It wasn't bad, I just didn't know how to make it sad enough. So I thought of using it for a different part of the game, but it was too sad for that. So yeah, that's not too great. I did, however, make the sound effects for buttons I added to the title screen. This is what it sounds like. Although simple, I really like how it sounds. I also coded and built in a walking sound effect and integrated sound effects to the final cutscene. For the walking, I just reused code from an unpublished previous project. However, this raised another issue. In previous games I've made, there was this problem where the walking animation would continue to play when the player interacts with something. This usually isn't a huge deal, but since I included a walking sound effect in this game, it got pretty annoying pretty quickly. So I took the time to find a fix for it. I basically just needed to add an extra if statement to the player script. Finally, I tried to add a settings screen for adjusting the audio in the game. I pretty much got it fully working, except I wasn't able to figure out how to set the state of the slider to match the volume of the audio bus when it first showed up. So I resolved to scrap that idea. The game didn't really need settings anyway. In Engine, I created a loading screen, fixed some visual issues, changed all the fonts to be a more pixelated font, and constrained the forest map area. I just felt that it was too open, which would make it easier for the player to get lost or confused. The vastness of the forest served no real purpose, so why complicate things? And finally, I playtested. Luckily, there weren't any major issues to fix. And after publishing my game to itch.io and submitting it to the judge, I was done. I didn't really think I would make it to the top 3, as the other games looked pretty good, and I didn't think my game fit the theme that well. But I ended up getting 3rd place out of 22 games. I'm happy with that. But most importantly, I'm happy with the game I made. This game encompasses exactly the kind of game I love to make, although I think it could probably do with some more gameplay bits. But why don't you let me know what you think? I always feel like my story-rich games could do with some more interactive sections, but I'm not exactly sure how or what to implement. My game is called Hollowed, and it would mean a lot to me if you checked it out and maybe gave me some critique or advice. I'm always looking to improve. If you want to play, I'll leave a link in the description. It's playable in browser and only takes about 20 to 30 minutes to play. But anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already to see more of this kind of content. And if you're interested in more of my art, feel free to follow me on Instagram. The link's in the description. Happy Halloween!